there's no way God's going to hear them, and that's what's symbolized by this iron plate. In a second performance parable, Ezekiel shaves his head with a combat blade. It could have been a sword, it could have been a dagger, but it is something intended for use in that type of a situation. And when he shaves this hair, it's divided into 3 equal weights. He's got balance scales there, and he's going to very carefully weigh this out. A third of the hair by weight is burned, and this represents the famine and disease killing people during the siege. Because you're on starvation rations, when famine and disease hit the city, it tends to spread like, fire on gasoline. A third is cut with the blade. He throws it in the air and cuts it with the blade, and this represents those people who are killed during combat operations, both during and after the siege of the city. A third is scattered to the wind, and this represents the refugee survivors who are going to go into captivity. And from this last third, a few hairs are gathered by Ezekiel, and they're hidden in his garment. Tucking these things away for a later purpose there. That's going to represent the remnant that's going to return. A reminder, I mentioned this in the introduction, I want to emphasize it again today. Pagan nations saw the temples of their gods as sacred places, and the gods were obligated to protect their temples. Remember, in pagan worship, it's essentially an economic system. The gods need worship, we need the gods to do stuff, so we're going to make the appropriate sacrifices at the temple, and that obligates the god to do the thing that we need them to do. Very economic type of a transition. And in chapter 2, verse 5, Ezekiel refers to Judah as Goyim, which means that they are a pagan or a Gentile people, so they're just like the nations around them by this point. And now they say, we're never going to fall because we're God's people and we have God's temple, because they are relying on God to protect his temple because he needs to worship like the other pagan gods. And if God will not or cannot help them, then they're going to appeal to other gods because that's what you do as pagans. So that's their mindset. Does that make any sense as God-fearing people? Not at all. But that's who they are now. They are Goyim, and this is how Goyim tends to think about these situations. And that kind of helps explain what we're going to start to see when we get into the text. So, let's turn to Ezekiel chapter 8, and I would like a volunteer to read verses 1 through 6 for us, please. Sharon?
In the 6th year, in the 6th month, on the 5th day of the month, I was sitting in my house, and the elders of Judah were sitting in front of me, and there the hand of the Lord God came down on me. I looked, and there was someone who looked like a man. What seemed to be his waist down was fire, and from his waist up was something that looked bright, like the gleam of amber. He stretched out what appeared to be a hand, and took me by the hair of my head. Then the Spirit lifted me up between earth and heaven, and carried me in visions of God to Jerusalem, to the entrance of the inner gate that faces north, where the offensive statue that provokes jealousy was located. I saw the glory of the God of Israel there, like the vision I had seen in the plain. The Lord said to me, Son of man, look forward, look toward the north. I looked to the north, and there was this offensive statue north of the altar gate at the entrance. He said to me, Son of man, do you see what they are doing here? More detestable acts that the house of Israel is committing, so that I must depart from my sanctuary. You will see even more detestable acts.
Okay, so looking at the time period that we're talking about here, if Ezekiel is using the same references in chapter 1, then this vision comes about 14 months after his original call. That means we are roughly 4 years, plus or minus a couple, 3 months maybe, to the destruction of Jerusalem. 4 years. So this thing is really getting close. You'll notice in verse 1 that Ezekiel opens by mentioning the fact that who's with him? The elders. Why are the elders of Judah are with Ezekiel in this particular time, and the reason they are there is not stated. Why are they there? Well, one of the things that we know from our previous historical studies is that people back in Jerusalem and Judah are having this idea that within 2 years, all of these people and all this stuff that went into Babylonian captivity is going to return back to Jerusalem. That's the false prophecy there. So that maybe there's a little bit of wishful thinking going on here. Ezekiel give us a message from God that says it's all going to be okay. It could be that they're wanting to get news about events in Judah. Judah is 1,000 miles away from where the exiles are. News will travel, but it will travel slow. If something happens in Jerusalem, it's going to be 2 months before they're going to hear about it in Shebar, because that's, they don't have telephones and all of these kinds of modern conveniences that we have now. So it could take a while. Maybe they're just wanting some of that. It could be something as simple as Ezekiel has been doing weird things. Let's go sit with Ezekiel and see what weird thing he's going to do next. All I can say is pick one and go with it. They're there for whatever motive that they have, and Ezekiel is going to deliver the message to them, whatever he gets from God. So in verse 3, Ezekiel clearly understands that he is going to Jerusalem in a vision. What this means is that parts of this vision will be fairly literal. He was a priest in Jerusalem. We don't know if he was old enough to have served as a priest or not. Some commentators say no, some commentators say yes. I'm of the opinion that he was, because he would go into the temple and he can understand what all of these things is that he's looking at, because he would have been trained and served in that capacity. I could also speculate a little bit that maybe while he was doing this for real, before he was taken into exile, that it bothered him. Maybe that's one of the reasons he goes into the second exile, because that's the group that God wants to preserve, because he can work with these people. So that's speculation, not really relevant altogether. But he would know that, I believe he would recognize the temple when he gets there and what's going on in there. So there's a particular emphasis on the north gate. This was known as the altar gate in that day and time, because priests would pass through this gate on their way to approach the altar in the outer court. So remember, you have a building in the middle of the temple that's got the holy place and the Holy of Holies, and then there's a courtyard where they have the altar of burnt offerings and the bronze laver and all of these kinds of things. So they're going to pass through this to do this kind of a thing. And as we're going through the temple, we're going to see 4 kinds of idolatry represented as going on in the temple. 4 is the number of the totality, so this represents the 4 corners of the land, or the entire land of Judah. So what is he telling us here? 2 things. Number 1, the idolatry is in the temple. Now this is not symbolic language, this is literal. We know that they had the idols moved into the temple there. And number 2, it has permeated and infiltrated the entire land. In fact, if you had read chapter 6 and 7, you would have heard him prophesying against the mountains of Judah. And he would be prophesying against them because of the high places and the sacred groves that the people were worshiping at. Did the mountains do anything wrong? Mountains are piles of rock. They don't do things. But that's, it's a symbolic prophecy against the land, because this is going on there, and the judgment that's a judgment against the mountains is actually against the people. So, it has permeated this just the way that he is describing for us here. And one of the things to notice in verse 4 is, while he's at this north gate, that the glory of the God of Israel is by the north gate. Now, in the original construction of the tabernacle and later the temple, where would the glory of God be? In the Holy of Holies. That's where it is. It's not there now. It's by the north gate. Well, the priests would go into the temple to serve by the north gate. They would also exit the temple by leaving through the north gate. So the position of God in this particular location is probably not a coincidence. He's basically on his way out, and we're about to see all of the reasons why he's being provoked to doing this. But before God leaves this temple, he's going to execute his judgments. He's going to start this judging process here. In verse 5, there's a mention of the idol of jealousy. And what did your translation say?
It says a statue that provokes jealousy.
The statue that provokes jealousy. Some other translations have something similar in there. It's an idolatrous image that provokes God to jealousy. 2 points to keep in mind here. Jealousy has a real negative connotation in our society. Most people try to act as this: A, it doesn't exist, or if it does exist, it's my fault if I have it. That's not entirely true. Jealousy is also sometimes used to describe other negative emotions that aren't really jealousy, like envy or something like that. But jealousy is the reaction to having a relationship or a trust with another person that ought to be yours be violated and be given to someone else. You know, if your spouse cheats on you, you're supposed to feel jealous about that. If you don't feel jealous about that, maybe you weren't all that invested in that relationship either. But, you know, that's what this is talking about. This is an image that causes God to react in this way. He describes himself as a jealous God, and this is the context he describes himself as a jealous God, is what he's saying here. The image itself is not identified. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm just a little bit curious about that. You know, what kind of a thing could this be that's in the courtyard of the temple that provokes this kind of a jealousy? There's lots of candidates to choose from. A very popular one in that particular time was Baal-Hadad, the Canaanite god of storms. When you talk about Baal in the Old Testament, that's this guy. Maybe it would be that image. Later on, when we go in there, we're going to see that the things that Ezekiel describes as going on in secret rooms in the temple have a very Egyptian feel to them. So maybe it's one of those things that it could be. But ultimately, it doesn't matter. It's not what it is, it's the fact that it even exists in this location that's the problem. Now, lesson that you and I ought to learn out there, you know. If we are honoring something above God, if we're taking a relationship and affection that we ought to have for God and giving it to something else, that is, number one, idolatry. Whether we're, you know, believing gods or not, that is, number one, idolatry. And number two, how does God react to it? It's a provocation to jealousy, is it not? It is an image or an idol or a thing that causes God to feel jealous. So, what's the proper response to do there? Yeah, you got to get that thing out of there. You got to start working on this thing and getting that out of there, and that's, you know, the process we know in the New Testament, repentance. You know, we don't stop repenting just because we were baptized. That's kind of like this is an ongoing process as we're finding these things and removing them. That's the proper response there. They're not doing that, and so that's making the jealousy even worse or even stronger. So. That's an important point to keep in mind as well. Any questions or comments? We already talked about this. And so in verse 6 he says, yes, this is bad. It's right here in the courtyard. It's just amazing that this is right here in God's temple, and nobody seems to be minding it or anything like that because they're goyim, and yet Ezekiel will see even greater abominations. So, you know, this kind of like buckle up and go for the ride here because it's going to get worse. So let's turn to Ezekiel chapter 8 and have a volunteer read verses 7 through 13. Gary, you had your hand up earlier. Why don't you take that?
7 through 13?
Yes, please.
Ready? And he brought me to the door of the court, and when I looked, behold, a hole in the wall. Then said he unto me, Son of man, dig now on the wall. And when I had digged in the wall, behold, a door. And he said unto me, Go in, and behold the wicked abominations that they do here. So I went in and saw, and behold, every form of creeping things and abominable beasts, and all the idols of the house of Israel, portrayed upon the wall round about. And there stood before me them 70 men of the ancients of the house of Israel. And in the midst of them stood Jaazaniah, the son of Shaphan, with every man in his censer in his hand. And a thick cloud of incense went up. Then said he unto me, Son of man, hast thou seen the ancients of the house of Israel do in the dark, every man in the chambers of his imagery? For they say, The Lord seeth us not, the Lord hath forsaken the earth. He said also unto me, Turn thee yet again, and thou shalt see greater abominations than they do.
Okay, now I think we're getting into a part of the vision here that's more symbolic or more figurative language there. There might not be a secret hole in the wall or something like that, but one of the things about using this type of figurative language or symbology is we are getting God's perspective on this. So what's the gist of the message here? He goes to this place, God shows him there's a hole in the wall. He said, dig into the hole, and he goes in there, and there's a door on the other side, and he goes in, and there's a whole lot of weird stuff going on that's basically being done in secret. Because why would you do something in secret? You want to hide it, right? You know, whatever you're doing, if you think about, if you could decide to ever to do something, silly and wrong, like embezzle from your employer, how many of us will go into work in the morning that we decide to do this and say, tell coworkers, let's sit down and have a cup of coffee. I've decided to embezzle $50,000 off of my employer. I just wanted to share that with you, but don't tell anybody. That's kind of like the height of stupidity, is it not, to even do that? We don't want people to find out what we're doing when we're in these types of things. Generally, we want to keep our sin hidden, and that's what they're wanting to do here. There's a little bit, another aspect of the secrecy that may be in play here that we'll talk about in a minute. But this thing is being done in secret. So in this time period, there were several buildings spaced around the inner court which formed a court of their own, probably had a wall around them, and Ezekiel would have been familiar with it. The idolatry is being practiced here in secret. And in verse 10, this description of what's inside this room that he goes into, every form of creeping thing, beast, and detestable things with all the idols of the house of Israel were carved on the wall around it. That is a very good description of the inner chamber of an Egyptian temple. Now, we know from our understanding of the history of this particular time period, Judah sits on the border between Babylon and Egypt. And they don't want to be a Babylonian vassal, and so they are conspiring with Egypt to rebel. And so it looks like what they've done in this room is they've imported some aspects of Egyptian worship or Egyptian paganism in here, and they're worshiping in secret. Now in verse 12, they talk about God's left the land and he doesn't see us anymore. So maybe the secrecy here is not hiding it from God as much as it is hiding it from the Babylonians, because they are also a pagan people. And if they find out our vassals are over here fooling around with the Egyptian deities and things like that, we're about to drop the hammer on you. So that, that's another possibility as well. In verse 11, we see that 70 elders of the house of Israel are burning the censers in their hand. Jaazaniah is mentioned specifically in this passage as somebody of significance in Jerusalem at this time. He is the son of Shaphan. Shaphan was the secretary of King Josiah, who oversaw the cleansing of the temple. Ahaz brought idolatry in. Hezekiah got it out. Manasseh brought it in again. And then when Josiah became king, he got it out. This is the son of the guy who cleaned up the temple and got it all repaired and restored. And then when Josiah died, guess what they did? They brought it all right back in again. So this is the son of that particular individual. So perhaps there's a little bit of irony in the situation that he's one of the primary instigators of this. 7 is the number of completion or perfection. It's used as the number of God, and it's also used as the number of the covenant. And so the fact that 70 elders are standing around in this room burning incense on censers is a complete breach of the covenant in several different ways. First of all, we're all committed to it. Second of all, who's supposed to burn the incense inside the temple? Priests. Are these guys priests? No, they are not. They are elders. They probably shouldn't even be in this part of the temple doing this, but they are, and they're doing it, and it's a breach of the covenant. So, questions or comments? Yes?
Isn't it interesting, the two things that we've seen so far in the visions is what they're doing in public with the altars as they're entering, and what they're doing in private.
Yeah.
So it's showing the whole entirety of the person. What you're doing publicly goes against God, and what you're doing internally goes against God.
Yeah, that's it's admirably consistent, isn't it? Usually we want to be, if we're going to mess around with stuff like this, what we do in public, we want that to appear right. It's the private stuff that we're trying to keep hidden. But they're not. They have made the commitment, both publicly and privately, this is the path we're choosing. And they're making it based upon the idea that our relationship with God isn't working. He's not really saving us. And it's not God's problem at all, is it? They don't understand who they're dealing with or what the nature of God actually is. So when they're talking about verse 12 that God does not see us, the Lord has forsaken the land, this is not a denial of the existence of God. But it denies that God is concerned or cares enough to assist or can assist at all. You know, what reason do they have? Pick one and go with it. They're all wrong. They're all equally destructive. So, you know, find one that suits you and go with it, or ignore them all. But there's a pagan inference here that God isn't holding up his end of the agreement. What was the agreement from the pagan perspective? Temple. Protect temple. We will do the worship and present the proper sacrifices here. You will protect your temple. And he's not doing that from the pagan perspective. Again, they have completely misunderstood the relationship. And it's possible for us to do that today too. I mean, if somebody's coming to church with the attitude, you know, I put a couple bucks in the collection plate, I got my Lord's Supper, I am good for the week to do whatever I want. That's a pagan mentality. That is a reflection of the same mentality that these people are exercising. And it's a dangerous thing to do because of that. Okay, any other questions or comments? Let's have a volunteer read verses 14 through 18 for us, please. Candy?
So he brought me to the door of the north gate of the Lord's house, and to my dismay, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. Then he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Turn again, you will see greater abominations than these. So he brought me into the inner court of the Lord's house, and there, at the door of the temple of the Lord, between the porch and the altar, were about 25 men, with their backs toward the temple of the Lord, and their faces toward the east, and they were worshiping the sun toward the east. And he said to me, have you seen this, O son of man? Is it a trivial thing to the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they commit here? For they have filled the land with violence. Then they have returned to provoke me to anger. Indeed, they put the branch to their nose. Therefore I also will act in fury. My eye will not spare, nor will I have pity. And though they cry in my ears with a loud voice, I will not hear them.
In verse 14, it says, it brought him to the entrance of the gate of the Lord's house toward the north, and behold, women were sitting there weeping for Tammuz. This is another form of idolatry that we're probably not very familiar with. The Cult of Tammuz was an ancient cult that dates to the ancient city of Byblos, located in modern Lebanon. Byblos was famous for its library, and it is from the name of the city Byblos that we get the word Bible, or collection of books, so, or bibliography and things like that. That comes from this particular city. The city was first occupied around 8800 BC, and then it was unoccupied for a while, and then beginning around 5000 BC, it has been roughly continuously inhabited, and so it is one of the longest continuously inhabited sites on the planet in terms of humanity here. So, old city, rich heritage. Tammuz was a fertility god and consort to Ishtar. Now, fertility gods and things like that typically revolved around the agricultural cycle. And the way that these were worshipped in that day and time is, you know, we have spring, summer, fall, and winter. And so when the spring lands, when the fall comes, talk about that first. That's the time when the fertility god or goddess dies or goes to sleep or something like that. And so they do a lot of weeping and things like that because they're gone and the land's not going to be fertile for a while. And then in the spring, they're reborn or reawakened or resurrected and things like that. And so we do a lot of extreme joy because they're back again and now they can do the job. So that's kind of the thing that they're doing here. So they are weeping for this god. This is in the 6th month, which normally they would do this in the 4th month of their calendar. Yes?
Yeah, that's what I was going to say. I have a note that says they did this because they wanted, the Ishtar was the wife of that guy, Tammuz.
Yeah.
And they believed like it would bring him back to life.
Yeah, exactly. And so to do this on a yearly basis. I mean, to me it sounds like here's a nice religious reason to have a big emotional party. But, you know, that's what they're going to do. One commentator said they're doing this in the 4th month, which is our April. That is actually incorrect. The Jewish calendar begins in September. So, well, after the Yom Kippur and the Day of Atonement, things like that, that's when their month begins. So the 4th month for them would be right around December, which is the winter solstice. So that's the time you would do the weeping, and that would be consistent with the other behavior there that they're talking about. Yes?
John, what was the sacrifice to that God?
Tammuz?
Yeah,
No clue.
I was wondering if they were sacrificing kids or anything like that.
Well, this one wasn't the one that they did that to. Moloch was the one they did that to. And that's actually, well, I got a quote coming up from Jeremiah. And in the quote that I got from Jeremiah, the verse after the end of the quote talks about that you were burning your children to these idols, in Jerusalem. So they were doing that. This just isn't the guy. So, well, anyway, you have these two periods of excessive grief and excessive joy every year as they're, moving to get their fertility god back on the job again. And the rites, I mentioned this already. The worship of Tammuz continued in the Middle East until the 14th century AD. To put that in a little bit of a context, Islam is a monotheistic religion and it's very anti-pagan. It took them 800 years to get this thing out of the land that they were holding. So this was a pretty intense cult that these people were dedicated to. But again, you have a form of idolatry being practiced inside the temple by people who are not priests. So, it's pretty much open season for whatever you want to do in this particular temple. Ezekiel sees this all within the temple confines itself. And then we go to the inner court of the temple. The inner court is right before, or is either the holy place or right the last thing before you go into the holy place. It was the court of priests. Now, if he's dealing with the outside courtyard here, this is where the altar of burnt offerings would be, the bronze laver and things like that. Only the priests go in here to make these particular sacrifices, and yet we have 25 men who are doing this. There were 24 courses of priests in, under the law, and then the 25th one would be the high priest. And so basically all of the priests who are supposed to be the people who are serving God are in fact in this place serving idols here. Some scholars also believe that they're not priests, and if true, it still doesn't matter. They don't belong here either, but we've already seen that. But the people who are supposed to be preserving God, that was their commission under the law of Moses, to preserve the teaching and the explanation of the law, are in fact rejecting him. The other thing that's kind of interesting here is it talks about in verse 16, there were about 25 men with their backs to the temple of the Lord and their faces toward the east, and they were prostrating themselves eastward toward the sun. The door to the temple faced east. So if these guys are facing east, where are their backs? Be really good if I could just stand here and teach this class like this, wouldn't it? But the body language would suggest that maybe I don't really want to talk to you guys. If you were to walk up to somebody and start talking to them and they turn their back to you, they don't want to talk to you. You got a pretty clear indication of that. So right in the temple, in the presence of the God that could actually help them, they got their backs turned to him. Now, is this literally going on? Probably not. You would think that they would be a little bit more subtle than that, but I can't guarantee it. From God's perspective, this is what is happening there. They are turning their backs on him in this way and going after anything else, everything else to try to save themselves. Already talked about that. Here's the quote from Jeremiah that I had for you. In Jeremiah 32, verses 33 and 34, and they have turned their back to me and not their face, though I taught them, teaching again and again. They would not listen and receive instruction, but they put their detestable things in the house which is called by my name to defile it. If you want to open your Bibles and go and look at verse 35 in there, you'll see, probably the ultimate form of idolatry. They are also practicing that, making their children pass through the fire. When you read in the Old Testament the phrase, make your children pass through the fire, they're not talking about singeing a little hair or anything like that. They're talking about offering their children as a burnt offering to some idol. The cult of Moloch actually existed before the time of Abraham. Roughly 2200 BC, at least by then. It was a well-established cult. And it manifested itself amongst the Canaanites and other people of this area in a variety of different ways. You will see sometimes mentions of the word of the idol Chemosh as being one that they did this to. You know, any number of these deities that they did this to, and they did this in the Valley of Hinnom outside of Jerusalem. Josiah cleaned it up during his reformations, and of course, like everything else, when Josiah died, what did they do? Put it all back. Got to get this thing, you know, Josiah was a nice guy. He was a really good king. Everybody loved him. Now it's time to get back to business. You know, sorry he's dead. Time to get back to business. Matt?
Verse 33, though I taught them teaching again and again, that phrase again and again comes up quite a bit.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of 2nd Chronicles, we're kind of wrapping up the end of Judah and God's basically him acting to judge them. It says that he rose up again and again, sending the prophets, speaking to them from early, before it got out of hand. But then it says, until there was no remedy.
Yeah.
So there was nowhere he could turn to find anybody that was going to listen or to a prophet or receive, any kind of reasoning about what was going on and how they needed to fix it. So God's got Jesus in his mind, and he's got our salvation hanging in the balances. And he still waits until there's just no remedy, and then he allows these things to happen to save a remedy.
Tim?
So I forgot we were skipping 6 and 7.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things that I read in 6 stuck out to me. It's talking about the remnant. And he said, then those of you who escape will remember me among the nations where they are carried captive, because I was crushed by their adulterous heart, which has departed from me. So God uses this analogy of being crushed like a man who is continually dealing with an unfaithful wife.
Yeah.
But he puts it in human terms that we can understand. He's broken.
Mm-hmm.
He's crushed.
Yeah.
That just stuck out to me.
Yeah.
And I see why.
Yeah, yeah. And then, and using that relationship, the marriage relationship is the most intimate relationship we form on this earth. It is something to be treasured. It is something to be enjoyed. It is intended to be a blessing. And then to have somebody just completely reject, your affection, to completely reject your emotional investment in the relationship, or any number of other reasons to go pursue this other relationship, that hurts, that cuts. I mean, this is the most intimate relationship that we form, and when this is violated, this is probably the one that hurts us the worst, And if it doesn't, there's another problem. There's probably something a whole lot more serious than just that. So that's why it's used that way. Because this is the one that we can understand and we can relate to. Well, that was good. So, proceeding on into the inner court a little bit more here. It says, is it too light for a thing for the house of Judah to commit the abominations which they have committed here, that they have repeatedly filled the land with violence and provoked me repeatedly? For behold, they are putting the twig to their nose. So he talks about abominations and violence. Abominations is the way God is characterizing their sins against him. Violence actually represents their sins against other people. Now, this is kind of one of those things that is real common in human history and human character. When we lose sight of who God is, we lose sight of who we are. Lose sight of God, lose sight of who we are. And that means we're going to treat each other differently. Now, sometimes we'll wrap it up in religious words or vocabulary or something like that. But how I react to you and how you react to me is in large part governed about what do I see. If we see each other as children of God created in the image of God, that suggests a proper course of treatment, a proper course of respect for each other. Now, we don't always do that because we're human beings, but that's the lesson that it teaches us. When we don't see each other as that, then you are something else, I am something else. You might be a target, you might be an inconvenience, you might be something to hate, but you are not being treated the way, with the respect that you should be treated as a child of God in doing that. And so violence is a really good term for it, because that's tends to be where we go. Once we harden our hearts to a certain position, that's where we go. The idea of putting the twig to the nose in this verse is a practice that was well understood in Ezekiel's time, but has since fallen into obscurity. What is it? Kind of curious about that. It may refer to an idolatrous practice. It may refer to controlling livestock. It may be an insulting or rude gesture. The way that it's talked about here kind of suggests it might be, the insulting type, rude type gesture. It may be one of those things, also be one of those things that when you do this, you look really foolish. And it's insulting at the same time, and so maybe it's like the equivalent of back in, say, high school, you go up and pick a fight with the toughest guy in the school, and you get whooped really good, and you kind of wonder, well, why did that guy whoop me so bad? Well, why did you pick the fight? You knew he could do this, why would you pick the fight with him? So it doesn't make you look either intelligent or, particularly good in any possible way. So, but, verse 18, therefore, and this is the conclusion, based on this extreme provocation of what we've seen in the temple. Where's the idolatry? Everywhere. It's everywhere. You can't find a corner in the temple in God's house that it's not there. Who's doing it? Everyone. Everyone who Ezekiel encounters in the temple is doing this. What is it doing to their character? Abominations and violence. And, how do you deal with it? This is, the judgment is coming. There is no alternative at this particular point. And with this wrath, there is going to be no possible way to avoid or escape it. And it is that certain here. This is the extreme that they've gotten to, and this is the extreme that God is going to have to go to cleanse it out of them. It's going to be painful. Any other questions or comments or closing thoughts? Yeah, this is scary stuff. It should be scary stuff. It doesn't mean we have to go down this path. But, it's one of those things that take note of it and say, they got here. It took them years to do this, but they got here, and now they're about to pay a price for it. So we'll see you all next week, and we'll look at chapter 9. Thank you.
Well, it's literally in church.